The ISO story. The ISO, International Organization for Standardization, is the world's largest developer of voluntary international standards. They were founded in 1947 and since then have published 21,607 international standards covering almost all aspects of technology and business. Today they have members from 163 countries and about 135 people work full-time for the Central Secretariat in Geneva, Switzerland. In London in 1946, 65 delegates from 25 countries met to discuss the future of international standardization. In 1947, ISO officially came into existence with 67 technical committees, groups of experts focusing on a specific subject. ISO's first offices. In 1949, ISO moved into offices in a small private house in Geneva. In the early 1950s, the Central Secretariat had 5 members of staff. In 1951, the first ISO standard, called Recommendations at this time, ISO/R1, 1951, Standard Reference Temperature for Industrial Length Measurements, was published. Since then, the standard has been updated numerous times and is now ISO 1, 2002, Geometrical Product Specifications, GPS, Standard Reference Temperature for Geometrical Product Specification. The ISO Journal. Since its creation, ISO has published monthly information about its technical committees, the standards published, and administrative changes to the organization and its members. This is the cover of the ISO Journal from May 1952. ISO General Assembly, Stockholm. In 1955, ISO members gathered in Stockholm for the Third General Assembly. At the beginning of 1955, ISO had 35 members and 68 standards, called recommendations. Henry St. Ledger was the Secretary General. SI, International System of Units. In 1960, ISO published the standard ISO 31 on quantities and units, which has since been replaced by ISO 80,000. ISO 31 is based on SI, System International Units. The SI sets out one unit for each quantity. For example, the meter for distance and the second for time. The objective of the SI system is to reach worldwide uniformity in the units of measurement. ISO 80,000 sets out these units and how to use them. 1960s, ISO and developing countries. During the 1960s, ISO worked to include more developing countries in its international standardization work. In 1961, it establishes DevCo, a Committee for Developing Country Matters, and in 1968 introduces correspondent membership. This allows developing countries to be informed of international standardization work without the full costs of ISO membership. Correspondent membership continued to be a popular option for many countries today. At the start of 2012, ISO had 49 correspondent members. Learn more about ISO and developing countries in the link below. Freight containers. In 1968, ISO published its first standard on freight containers. Freight and packaging is one of the areas where ISO has been particularly active, changing the way goods travel across the world. The End of Technical Nationalism. In 1969, Olli Sturen became Secretary General of ISO. In one of his first speeches, he said, "International standardization is the end of technical nationalism." Environment on the agenda. In 1971, ISO created its first 2 technical committees in the environmental field, air quality and water quality. Today, these committees have been joined by other groups of environmental experts focusing on many subjects, including soil quality, environmental management, and renewable energy. During the 1970s, ISO's Secretary General, Olli Sturen, focused on turning ISO into a truly international organization. While ISO's members came from all over the world in the early 1970s, relatively few are fully active in the development of international standards. Sturen's visits to members result in active participation from countries such as Australia, Japan, and China. The Central Secretariat also reflects this international feel, with an average of 25 nationalities represented. Lawrence D. Eicher becomes Secretary General. In 1986, Lawrence D. Eicher takes over as Secretary General. Sadly, Eicher passed away in 2002 while still serving as ISO Secretary General. The Lawrence D. Eicher Award for Excellence in Standardization has been set up in his memory. ISO 9000 Family. In 1987, ISO published its first quality management standard. Standards in the ISO 9000 family have gone on to become some of the most well-known and best-selling standards. ISO goes digital. In 1995, ISO launched its first website. 5 years later, in 2000, ISO started to sell its standards online. ISO 14001. In 1996, ISO launches its Environmental Management System standard, ISO 14001. The standard provides tools for companies and organizations to help them identify and control their environmental impact. New leadership, new technologies. In 2003, Alan Bryden is appointed Secretary General. Under his 5-year term, ISO expanded to work to cover new technologies such as nanotechnology and biofuels. Bryden also actively supports ISO's work on social responsibility, which leads to the launch of ISO 26000 in 2010. Information security. In 2005, ISO and IEC's Joint Technical Committee, JTC1, launched ISO/IEC 27001, a management system standard on information security. As businesses became increasingly reliant on information technology, securing the system and minimizing risks is ever more important. ISO 27001, 2005, has become one of ISO's most popular standards. ISO's new offices. In 2007, ISO moved to its current offices in La Vaucluse, Geneva. Today, the Central Secretariat employs almost 150 people, a significant increase from the staff of 5 in the early 1950s. ISO goes to Hollywood. In 2008, ISO, ITU, and IEC were congratulated with an Emmy Award for their work in producing an advanced video coding standard, this video being a result of that milestone. Simpler, faster, better. In 2009, ISO's current Secretary General, Rob Steele, was appointed. ISO took on a new mission to be simpler, faster, and better, to cut down standards development time, and to better serve the needs of today's society. ISO 26000. In 2010, ISO 26000, the international standard providing guidelines for social responsibility, was launched. The working group that developed ISO 26000 is one of the largest and most diverse groups to develop an ISO standard. The resulting document is truly multi-stakeholder. ISO today. At the start of 2012, ISO had 163 members and had a total of over 19,000 standards. Today, ISO international standards cover almost all aspects of technology and business. All material covered in this course was taken from this link.